I'll begin this afternoon's session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I will be hosting today's session. Today is Wednesday, November 13th, 2024, and this is the second session in the e-lecture series featuring graduate student research. For today's session, we are very pleased to have Katherine Tripp, who will give an exciting presentation titled, How Do White Spruce Stands Respond to Drought in Maritimes? To kick things off, Katherine began her academic journey with a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental and Physical Geography from Nipissing University, graduating in 2021. Before starting her Master's of Science in Forestry, she spent several summers with Ontario Parks as a research technician, gaining extensive experience in forest ecology, biology, and the human dimensions of environmental science. She had the unique opportunity to conduct research while on the canoe trips. With that, I will now pass it over to Katherine.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to my presentation today. I'm Katie, like she said. I live in Fredericton at the University of New Brunswick. And I'm going to present the results of my master's thesis today. And this project is looking at how white spruce stands respond to drought in the Maritimes. And part of the reason we want to look at this is because drought is very likely going to be an increased problem in the Maritimes in the future. And also white spruce is a very economically and environmentally important species in our area. So the real reason that we started this project is that in 2020 and a few years before that as well, there was a pretty severe drought in New Brunswick. And it was bad enough that it was picked up by the media. And also now there's papers starting to come out about how this drought impacted the Acadian forest. And we wanted to see how white spruce specifically responded to this drought period. So to start with how the trees specifically respond to drought and why that's something that we want to measure is trees can use a few ways to try to prevent the effects of drought by using deep soil moisture, which is when they just push to the very limits of their rooting system to access every bit of moisture deep in the soil if it hasn't been replenished recently. Trees can also use stomatal regulation, which, especially because white spruce are isohedric species, they close their stomatas almost immediately under water stress, which prevents water loss, but also prevents photosynthesis from happening. And then if the stomatas are closed for too long, eventually trees can have stress from lack of carbon because they have a bit of reserves, but eventually that runs out, and too much of this stress can eventually lead to mortality. When trees are under drought stress, the first thing that stops happening is growth, because the trees are then focusing on survival techniques. But this reduction in growth during a drought allows us to measure its stress during tree rings or through tree rings. And this figure at the bottom is showing how 6 different white spruce provinces from across Canada responded to 2 drought periods, shown in gray. And just an example of how trees, white spruce specifically, often have a reduction in growth during drought stress. So why specifically white spruce in the Acadian forest? Again, it is a growing concern on the impact that drought will have in the Acadian forest. There will likely be an increase in drought frequency and severity. The mean summer temperature is expected to rise by around 5 degrees by the end of the century, according to climate prediction SSP 8.5. And precipitation in this area is expected to increase a little bit, but it's also expected to become much more erratic. And this together will likely still mean that there will be an increase in drought, because the higher temperatures with the similar precipitation will likely mean more drought. And white spruce in particular is an important species because it is very economically important in New Brunswick, and New Brunswick has a lot of forestry, and a lot of what is harvested is white spruce. And white spruce is also very sensitive to temperature, which is especially interesting, noting how the Acadian forest will have an increase in temperature mostly. And white spruce has projected net negative growth under all climate scenarios, so it's likely going to suffer. The next question I want to talk about is, are all trees equally vulnerable to drought across the landscape? The answer is probably not. There are a lot of different things that can impact the drought response tree to tree or site to site. Firstly, there are a variety of stand factors that can impact drought response. First being age, older trees experience greater reductions during drought. Usually, also somewhat closely related can be size. Larger trees are usually experiencing worse reductions during growth, partially because they have greater demand as larger trees, and they also face greater radiation exposure as they're bigger. And also density can play a big role in drought response, because stands that are in denser areas are facing much higher rates of competition, which means they're fighting for water and for access to sunlight. And a little note on density is, of course, one of the most common silviculture techniques that we use, is very helpful in managing density, and that is thinning. And this graph on the right is showing how two species each had a thinning treatment, shown on the dotted line. The species are in colors. And this graph shows in the gray area that during a drought, both the thin stands experienced less reduction in growth during the drought. Next are how site factors can impact drought response. Firstly, very steep slopes tend to have higher drainage or faster drainage, which means that the sites get dry a lot faster than on less steep slopes. Also, aspect can have an effect. In the Northern Hemisphere, south-facing slopes have longer sun exposure in the growing season, which makes them warmer and increases evaporation, especially on steeper slopes as well, because they're more directly facing the south. Soil texture also plays a big role, because more sandy soils have a lot more harder time holding on to that moisture, which can really be stressful for trees compared to more clay, silty sand or soils that might hold the moisture a little bit longer. Also, the depth to the water table can play an impact on the drought response, because if the water table is really, really deep, it's harder for the trees to access it versus if it's not too deep. So the goals that we had for this project and what we were expecting to see, our objective was to leverage this recent documented drought period in New Brunswick to determine how site and stand characteristics affected the drought sensitivity of white spruce radial growth. Our three main hypotheses were that higher competition reduces available water per tree, that larger trees display higher resource requirements, and that topography, aspect, and soil characteristics control available water. Now, the actual predictions that we are expected to see during this project are that there will be less growth in high density stands, that there will be less growth across bigger trees, and also there will be less growth in drier site locations due to this aspect sloped and types of soils that I mentioned before. So this project took place in western New Brunswick in the Blackbrook Industrial Freehold of J.D. Irving. That's just shown on the right here, the little inset map, and then all the little dots on the bigger set are where my sites were. They were around 50 kilometers apart, the furthest two. So not exactly across New Brunswick, but they did cover a little geographical area. This area has a fairly high amount of precipitation, especially if any of you are from the prairies or anything. with almost 1,200 millimeters per year. And this is pretty consistent all across the year, as you can see on the climate graph on the center bottom of this screen. And the temperature is a bit colder. It doesn't really have that much of an ocean effect, but it's still a very temperate area and gets a lot of snow. It's also a fairly hilly area. It's kind of the foothills side the Appalachian Mountains, so there is generally hilly areas, and the soils are composed of mostly glacial residuals and till, and fairly well drained. Very few relative wet sites in this area. The forest itself is part of this very heavily managed area, potentially one of the most managed areas in North America. And it contains 30% hardwoods, 30% planted black, white, and Norway spruce, and the rest are mixed wood, different things like that. So we ended up with 32 plots across 32 stands, and all of these sites were in white spruce plantations in this area, with an age range of 16 to 59. Because this is a very managed area, all of these trees will eventually get cut, and you're very hard pressed to try to find a tree older than 60. So that's where we have the age range that we do. The density also ranged from 250 meters squared to almost 2,000 meters squared, which plays into the amount of management that they get. And all stands over 25 years in this project had one commercial thinning, and most of them also at one point had pre-commercial thinning. So the way that we manage the plots is there was one variable size plot per stand, as we had a pretty high range in density, and we didn't want to do too much oversampling. And then we cored around 20 white spruce only trees per plot. We measured competition that included DBH and individual tree location mapping. We also collected soil samples for texture and nutrient composition and measured the tree heights, a subset of the tree heights. So the main response variable in this project is tree rings. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we make tree ring data usable or comparable. So we start off with this core, which is showing a lot going on, and each individual tree can have a very different response to the tree beside it. So that's one of the reasons why we transform the data from tree rings a little bit. And also because trees have an age pattern. So really young trees, the rings will be way bigger than when a tree is bigger. And so you detrend the data to try to remove that pattern. And I'm showing that difference there in this graph in the middle, showing the raw ring widths. You can see I've grouped this growth data by age class, and my young trees are growing on average of 4 to 5 millimeters per year, which is very high. The biggest rings that I saw in this project were a centimeter large, which is very, very big. And then the oldest trees are growing an average of 1 to 2 millimeters per year. So there's a pretty big difference there. And so what we did is we used a smoothing spline to remove that age pattern and then get the data that we have on the right, which is the detrended ring width, also known as ring width index. And so this is attempts to remove that age pattern and then show the climate effect on the growth of the rings. So that's what we are left with here. And I'll get into what those mean in a bit. So let's move into the results here. First, I'm going to look at the long-term sensitivity of growth of these trees to see if there is actually a relationship between drought and climate variables and the growth of the trees. And then I'll move into the specific drought period and the results of that. So the way that we assessed if there is actually a relationship between the tree rings and climate variables is we use something called a response function analysis, which is essentially, to simplify it, just a fancy correlation analysis. to relate the growth to historical climate. And we used a subset of just the 8 oldest plots because we wanted to get stands that had more rings, and some of the younger ones wouldn't have very many to compare to. And then we compared this to the months, a whole growing season before, up until that next growing season of a year. And then this is going to show the average of that for every year for around 50 years, which I'll show you now. Before I talk about the results of this graph, I'm going to explain it a little bit. This is showing the relationship between average temperature across the 8 different plots on the y-axis. Don't have to pay attention to what plot is what, but just that if there's more stars in a column, that means that there's a strong relationship there. The stars also mean that something is significant. And then the color is whether there's a positive effect or a negative effect, red being negative, blue being positive. So what we saw from the average temperature is that higher fall and spring temperatures increased growth, and that high July temperatures reduced growth. From the precipitation, we saw that high winter precipitation reduced growth, and that high precipitation was positive in the summer. Now, what does this actually mean for the growth of these trees? Like I said before, this area gets fairly high amount of snowpack, and this is telling us that likely this is impacting the start of the growing season and delaying it. If there's too much snow, the ice could be, or the soil could be frozen longer, and there could be just too much water for the trees to start growing. But also, a bit alternatively, this is also telling us that warm springs can start the growing season earlier, which the trees like. But also, summers are still getting too hot to grow. So moving on to this actual recent drought period, I'm going to talk about the drought itself, and then how the trees responded to drought and what our models showed us. So we wanted to quantify this the drought severity independently from the tree rings to see if there actually was something notable going on. And so we identified drought in a few ways. And I'm going to mostly refer to this graph on the right. Figure A is showing the drought in the gray area, and it's showing the mean summer max temperature with the black line and the mean summer precipitation with the blue bars. All of this and what I'm going to talk about after is including June, July, and August, the main growing season months. And so just figure A, which is just raw data, is showing that there were higher temperatures in during this drought period and also lower water. So that's a good start. Next, we use the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, which uses climate data to quantify drought. And this also showed us that during the drought period from 2017 to 2021, every year in that period was around -1, which is when you start considering it to be a drought, down to the worst year, which was 2020, which had a drought severity below -2, which is considered an extreme drought. We also looked at river flow data as a watershed discharge anomaly, which is also telling us how far from the norm the flow of those rivers was during those years. And again, this is showing us from 2017 to 2021, every year was a drought, and then 2020 and 2021 were extreme or near extreme drought. So this would make us think that, yes, there was definitely a drought, there were extreme droughts, and then there was a drought for this whole period, which hasn't been seen in the 60 years of our climate data, the single worst year in 60 years, and also no period as long or as severe together in this period. So we also makes you think that the trees might have reacted to this, especially considering my trees are 60 years old, so they've never seen something like this, apparently. So what did the trees actually think of this drought? We saw that there was a drop during this drought period. I'm going to tell you the numbers in the raw Ringworth data because it's a little bit more understandable. There's a drop in 0.7 millimeter, 0.07 millimeters on average during the drought period. And the lowest year, 2019, was a drop of almost 1 millimeter. And you can see even in the raw ring widths that I have on the left, indicated in the gray area, that there is a visible drop during this drought. And then I've zoomed in on the left to the ring width index, the detrended data, to show how the age classes are responding to the drought. And something to note is that the middle-aged and older trees had their worst year in 2019, while the youngest trees had a drop in 2018 and 2020, which is a little bit different. And this may have to do with masting, but we're not sure. But it's interesting that there's a different age pattern here. So moving into the final results, we use linear mixed effects models to determine which stand and site factors contribute to growth, as we had a lot of different things that we wanted to look at. As stand effects, we were looking at age, top height, and the time since thinning, which also included whether it was commercial thinning or pre-commercial thinning. We also had tree level variables, including DBH and a competition indice, which we used Hagee's index, which uses the size of trees and distance to surrounding trees. And then also a bunch of different side effects, which include soil water holding capacity, which included things like sand and silt content. And this is basically how much water a soil can hold. We also calculate bulk density, which is just basically the density of the soil, how much contents are in a certain volume of soil, the slope, aspect, water table depth, and a bunch of different nutrient contents. And so we had an initial model with this, and then we used a comparison of a bunch of other alternative models using different combinations of these variables and compared them using AICC. And also the model included all of the drought years with 2019 as the reference year. Before I get into the final result, or the final result, there's one notable result that we had was that there was a very low competition effect in this area. And this may not be that surprising if you know this area at all, but first, we're going to look at the figure on the right showing the competition values on the x-axis, with high values being higher competition, and basal area increment on the left, on the y-axis. Basal area increment is basically a measure of growth that also includes the DBH of a tree, not just the rings themselves. And so this is showing us that there is also a bit of effect of age here, or I'm saying age right now, but the red group, which is the middle-aged trees, seems to have no relationship to competition, regardless of the amount that they're growing. They're mostly huddled towards the zero value of competition. The oldest and the youngest trees seem to have a little bit more spread across competition. And the reason we think of this, that this is going on, is because of one, that the trees are very young in general, and that the thinning practices in Blackbrook are essentially reducing competition, that we can't measure it. We weren't able to capture it. And I'm showing on the graph on the left the density per age class. Age on the x-axis and density on the y-axis. So we've got a group of young stands on the left that have not yet had a commercial thing. And then the density drops way low for the next 20 to 30 years of age of the trees. And then it jumps up a little bit at the end, partially because of different thinning practices and buffer regions, etc. But this is showing us that the stands in the middle age class have really, really low density. And so this might be why we didn't really find a competition effect, which was one of our hypotheses. Our final result from the model is that large trees suffer the most during drought compared to everything else that we looked at. And this figure on the right is showing us the results from this model. And how you can interpret this is that a tree with 30 centimeter DBH will have a 40% reduction in growth during drought compared to a tree with around a 10 centimeter DBH which will drop like 10 to 15%. Some other notable non-significant predictors that we found were most of the site characteristics that I mentioned before. And the reason potentially that we didn't find any significant relationships with these things is that all of these sites were on plantations, which means that they were already planted where they thought the trees wanted to grow. They probably weren't on super steep slopes or super wet areas. And also, the site selection for this project focused mostly on capturing age and density, and all these other factors were secondary. So potentially, if we had focused more on them, we would have been able to capture more of the potential range in this area, but this is what we got. So to summarize this presentation, the 2017 to 2021 drought period was exceptional and has not been seen in this area in recent history. White spruce growth is favored by early springs and late falls, but is limited when summers get too hot. White spruce stands experience growth reductions during drought, but recovered without mortality that we saw, potentially due to the quite favorable temperate climate in this area. Thinning could also potentially explain the lack of density effects in this project. That larger trees face the greatest growth reductions during drought, and all of this can help inform land managers on to when to harvest, that thinning practices are helping, and what to expect with future climate warming. So to conclude, I'd like to thank my advisory committee, also my lab mates that helped with all the field and lab work that I had to do with my tree rings and soil. And thanks to Research Envy for funding this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. That was a great presentation. Before we proceed to answer the questions, let's take a moment to fill out a post-webinar survey. I'm just gonna launch it now. So there are 2 questions in total. You may need to scroll down to see the second question. I'm gonna leave the poll open for a minute. As it's quiet today, we don't have any questions so far. Katherine, would you mind sharing your email address in the chat in case people want to reach out to you if they have any questions later?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. All right. If there are no questions at this moment, I would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you all for participating in our CIF electronic lectures. And once again, thank you very much to Katherine for sharing your research. Bye, everyone.
All right, thank you.